This is Mrs. Moran of the Fort George Historical Society. Tonight we have two gentlemen who will give us their impressions of the early days in South Fort George, Prince George, and Central Fort George. We have Mr. Henry and Mr. Arnold Davis. Perhaps we'll start with Mr. Henry since he was here first. Mr. Davis, or Mr. Henry, could you tell us where you were born?
I was born in Oakland, California.
And when did you come to Canada?
I come to Canada in 1892 or 93, spring of 93.
You'd be pretty young.
Yes, very young.
And where were you raised, Mr. Henry?
Practically in the Caribou. I lived in Vancouver and then I come north.
Well, now, could you tell us a little bit about when did you come into the Caribou?
I come in the Caribou in 1909.
How did you happen to come into the Caribou?
Well, I was working in Vancouver and I didn't just care about it. I heard about the Prince George, the steamboats, so I decided I'd come north. And as I'm a pretty fair bicycle rider, the fare then was around $45 from Ashcroft to Quesnel. So I decided I'd bring my bicycle. So I shipped my bicycle from Vancouver to Ashcroft, and I rode from Ashcroft to Quesnel, which I lay around Quesnel for about a month, and I went to work for the BC Express Company.
Well, now, how did you find the roads for bicycle riding?
Well, I would say the roads were far better than they are today, because we had a narrow road and it was a good road.
How long did the trip from Ashcroft to Quesnel take?
It took me practically 3 days because I followed the stage right through. I had the stage as a guide and I followed them because I'd get lost if I didn't.
Oh, I see. How far would that be, Mr. Henry?
From Ashcroft to Quesnel?
Yes, about how far?
Yeah, well, they say it's 220 miles. So I figured I rode about 75 miles a day.
Well, that's a pretty good time. Now, you got to Quesnel, that was in 1909, and what happened from then on?
Well, I laid around Quesnel. I'd done a little odd work, waited for the BC Express, or the BX. They were building the boat that year, so they put it in the water and brought it to Quesnel, and they took a trial run, and I think it only went as far as the Cottonwood Canyon. I didn't know the river then. They went as far as the Cottonwood Canyon, and they come back, and the following year, we come right on through to Prince George.
Were you on the first run of the BX?
First run of the BX, yes, the maiden trip.
The boats, the BX that you were on ran from Quesnel to...
Yeah, run from Soda Creek to
from
South Fort George.
to South Fort George. It landed in South Fort George.
South Fort George, yes.
And did it go to Central?
Yes, we used to have occasional run to Central. We used to go there when our freight would gang up first, and we'd make a special trip and go to Central.
What did this boat that you were on carry?
It carried, well, I would say, the best way to explain that is provisions for the country, everything.
It would be the only way to get in.
The only transportation in the summer months.
Carried passengers?
Passengers, yes.
How much was the fare from...
Well, now, you've kind of got to stick there, but I believe it's around $35 from Quesnel to here.
One way?
One way.
I see. Quite a difference. How many months of the year would these boats
Well, we'd
run?
start in about the end of April, and we'd run somewhere around the 1st of November or a little sooner. 5th of November one year, we froze into Blackwater. We tried to make another trip. We come up through the Cottonwood. We got the Fort George Canyons closed, so we headed back for Quesnel. The Cottonwood is closed. So we headed back again, and we had to tie up behind the islands at Blackwater. And I stayed at the boat all year that year.
Stayed in the winter, did you?
We froze in, yes.
Could the big boats make the trip up and down the river in the spring and fall?
Just as soon as the river raised.
Was there any transportation after the ice went out between then and when the...
Yes, when the ice started to go out, the big boats are laying on the skidways, and they had a small boat, a gas boat, and I generally opened the navigation with a gas boat. I carried the mail and what passengers, because the Blackwater Road was getting too tough for sleighs, and it isn't fit for wheels. So I open navigation with the small boats. In fact, I have several clippings from the Canal Observer where Captain Henry, as they call me, opened the navigation for, I'd say, why wouldn't I? A number of years.
I see. Did you ever have any accidents or adventures on
We
the
did.
river?
One year on the, I was running the rounder that year.
Now you'll have to explain that.
Yeah, that's another gas boat.
Oh, I see.
And I was running the rounder, and I was pilot there, or skipper. And we lost a man overboard in the canyon. Because just before I come to the canyon, I told them, I said, now everybody be seated because we're going to shoot this canyon and be quiet. Well, this fella didn't heed, and he got up and he went overboard. So we tied up there for 2 hours to make sure he was dead or drowned or whatever it was. And we went on.
I see.
We never did see no more of him.
Did you ever have any difficulty navigating the boats through?
Well, we struck some pretty shallow water sometimes.
You ever run aground?
Oh, yeah, quite a few times.
You were telling me about discovering your homestead.
Yes. Should I put it this way? I claim I'm the only homesteader in this country that had a whole boatload, 120 ton, of groceries put on my homestead.
Well, that's quite a feat.
And I don't think there's another homesteader in this country that can claim that. But then the BC Express Company took it away and hired me again, so I went back to work.
How did it happen that that was left?
We hit coming upriver. We was coming from Soda Creek, and we hit at 8 Mile. Punched a hole in the boat, and we landed there and unloaded, because there's no facilities there for to patch the boat. So we unloaded and lightened the boat up, and then we come on through the canal. They pulled the boat out. Mr. Davis, what did I say, senior?
I guess so.
Yes. He done the repair works, and the boat was back in operation again in about a week. Then he come back and took my grub stake.
I see. You stayed with the grub stake, did you?
I stayed with the grub stake.
And was that where you later had your...
That's where I had my homestead.
I see. How many boats, big boats, would be running on the river in those years, Mr. Henry?
Well, there's the conveyor, the operator, BC Express, the BX, the canal, and the Chillicothe.
6, and several small boats.
Several small boats, yes.
I see. What years were you on those boats, Mr. Henry?
Well, I come up river, the first year is 1910, my first trip up through the canyon. That's the first year I seen South Fort George.
Were you on the BX all that time?
Practically straight right through.
I see.
The exception of 1 year, the Fort George Trading Lumber Company with the Chillicothe. They got a mate from Vancouver, and he come up, and he didn't know the river. This was Captain Foster. So they come over and transferred me from the BX to the Chillicothe to take mate's job. So I worked for the Fort George Trading Lumber Company that year on the Chillicothe as mate.
Otherwise, you were on the BX.
BX. I was transferred from the BX.
What finally happened to the BX, Mr. Henry?
Well, we sunk the BX in 1920. Put 120 ton of cement on her, and we sunk it.
I see.
It never did navigate after that.
Do you know what happened to the boat?
Yes, we come back to south and got the small boat, the rounder. Captain Brown was my skipper. But when we took the small boat, it's a gas engine, and I didn't know anything about the gas engine. So Captain Brown was my engineer, and I run the river for, I'd say, 3 weeks. And I was Captain Brown's skipper, and he was my engineer.
I see.
And we carried on until they got the BC Express ready, and then we took over again from there. Then they laid the small boat off.
Well, where did the BX end up?
The BX ended up in South Fort George. They shoved her upriver. The BC Express brought her home, and she was dismantled in South Fort George.
I see. How long would you say, Mr. Henry, that it would take to go from here to Quesnel?
Well, if we left here and went straight through, it'd be around 3 hours till we got to Canal. Not Soda Creek, just Canal.
Yeah.
But we had 2 stops. We had a stop at 22, and we had a stop at Alexander. Not Alexander, Duke of Sutton's. There's mail stops.
Yes.
So we carried the mail. But if we went right through, we'd be there in 3 hours.
I see.
Then
And what about coming back?
Well, coming back from Soda Creek, it took us practically as long from Soda Creek to Canal as it did from Canal here. And it's only 60 miles from Soda Creek, 62 miles from Soda Creek Canal. It took practically as long to come to that distance as it did from there here. Our average run was around in the neighborhood of 11 hours.
I see. Now, what about the winters, Mr. Henry? Did you spend any of them in this country?
Yes,
those
I
years?
spent several winters. I spent one winter in South Fort George, where the schoolhouse is today. A chum had worked on the boat with me. We built a log cabin.
In that spot?
We stayed there right where the schoolhouse is today.
I see.
So we wintered there.
What were your impressions of South Fort George in those very early years, 1910?
Well, we didn't figure on an awful lot until we heard about the railroad. Then we began to build hopes. But it was coming country. Work was plentiful. And we just figured it was a pretty good place to stick around.
Would you hazard a guess at what the population of South Fort George would be, say in 1910, 1911?
1910, I'd say around 700, 800.
Mostly male?
Mostly male, yes.
Were there many Indians in the population then?
We had an Indian reserve, what they call the Hudson Bay Post today. There was a rancherie there. There wasn't a great number, but it was quite a place. They had a church and huts there. I would say there'd maybe be 50 or something like that.
I see. What businesses were operating in South Fort George in those years, Mr. Henry?
Well, the business now, you've got me stuck there. We had the hotel.
The famous one?
The famous one, Northern Hotel. We had McGacken and Thorne. They had a little candy store, and they made their own candy and ice cream them days, when they could get cream. And
was it hard to get?
Well, it was. But they made all kinds of candies and chocolates there when they could get the supplies in. And that was that used to be our hangout. We used to go down there once in a while.
Any theaters?
Yes, there was one theater. I think it was, what they call it, Fort George Tribune, or I just can't remember the last name on it.
What about Central, Mr. Henry?
Central is a lively little town, and that was the town was supposed to be where we are today. When they heard the railroad was coming in, Central built up pretty fast. And they were figuring the railroad was going there, but Prince George kind of beat them to it, and they built the station here, and the Central had a sell out, freeze out, and burn out. So we all moved to Prince.
I see. Many tents in those days, Mr. Henry?
Well, yes. In the summer months there was. It was all tents, you might say.
I see.
All the new ones, they lived in tents or anything they kept under shelter. There was a few houses and the hotel there, but the hotel there only accommodates so many. But the working class come in and they stayed in there. They traveled them days where they took care of themselves. Didn't depend on somebody else.
I guess you'd be here when the railway came through.
Absolutely.
You'd see the changes that it made. Could you say anything about that?
Well, I can't say that because it spoiled a good job for me. I lost my job. The railroad comes in and the boats quit.
I see.
And they put me on the bank. So I just don't agree in the railroad.
You'd prefer the river?
I prefer the river, and we were getting along nicely, and since the railroad come in here, and the other PG&E come in, and then the airplanes come in, well, that's where river rats, we're just lost, that's all. We just get up on the bank.
How long were you on the river?
Practically 18 years. Yeah, roughly speaking, 18
Would
years.
you care to make a guess at how many trips you made up and down the Fraser?
No, I wouldn't guess that, but I can tell you we went twice a week. Sometimes made 3 trips. Bore a day off the next week.
From April to
Yes.
the fall for 18 years, more or less.
Take off my time I was overseas.
Yes.
But yeah. Outside that, I was making 2 trips, and sometimes we'd squeeze in the next trip, and borrow 1 day off the next week, and make our 3 trips.
Well, I think, Mr. Henry, we probably squeezed you dry of information for the moment. So I'll turn to Mr. Davis. How long have you been sheriff, Mr. Davis?
Approximately 10 years.
Have you? I think you have a very interesting family tree. Could you tell us a little bit about it before we quiz you about the early days?
I guess I'm a 6th generation in Canada, possibly, and my grandfather's great-grandfather originally 5 brothers came from Ireland, and I think 2 remained in Canada, and 3 went to the United States. And one of these 3 was Jeff Davis, who was president of the Confederate States in the South. And it's written in the family biography, but my father said he wouldn't boast of it because of that song of "Hang Him to a Sour Apple Tree." And from my mother's side of the family, they came from England at the time of the CPR construction, and they started somewhere on the prairies with the CPR, and they traveled with it as it came west. And at the time of the Real Rebellion, they were there. And during the trial of Louis Real, who was a school teacher, but being of French origin, he insisted on an interpreter. And during the trial, the interpreter stayed with them in the trial of Louis Real. And they came further west, and my grandfather said that he planted potatoes at Regina as the approximate location, or the area of Regina, and they just turned over the sod, the prairie sod, and put the potatoes in and carried on with the railroad and come back in the fall to dig them, and they had a wonderful crop of potatoes. They weren't hilled or worked at all. And they eventually came west to Calgary, and they were there with the railroad, and there was some sort of a slump or something on that year. I couldn't confirm the year or in fact much about it, but my grandmother said that they were a year without 5 cents in the community, and they just bartered and traded with each other, and my grandfather hadn't 5 cents in order to purchase a postage stamp to write home. And the clothes that they would have from the older children, they would tear apart and remake for the younger children. And from there they come on to Banff, and my grandfather took up a preemption where Banff is now located, the city of Banff. And he sold it for $200 to a chap who in turn turned it over to the CPR for quite a sum of money. And of course the old gentleman, he thought of that to the day he died. And from there they come on to Kamloops, to Kamloops, part of the family, and the rest at Ashcroft. And they started farming out of Ashcroft in a small sawmill. Now, that was during the time that the CPR was going through. And they lived there, and my grandfather died there. And my grandmother died in 1929 at about the age of 86 years or something. And my mother and father were married in Ashcroft.
I see.
Just prior to the turn of the century. And my father worked in Ashcroft for Miller, or for the BC Express Company, and he time, and during the time, and also during the time they had the sawmill. And then he came to Soda Creek at the time that Mr. Henry mentions it, 1909. And I believe his first trip to Fort George, as he told me, was in 1909. And the time that I myself was born in Ashcroft, and he was away most of the year, other than through the winter months. And in this year of June in 1917, we came to South Fort George for a trip, for a holiday for 2 months. And I can recollect my mother just locking the house and leaving it. And we have never got back there.
Quite a prolonged stay.
After that, it became the end of the First World War, and then the flu set in, which Mr. Henry can confirm, and they had very difficult times here then.
Yes.
And we never did get back.
Mm-hmm.
My father was here on the boats, and then till when we come, he was purser, I think, that summer. But I just don't recollect all he did. And he was here until Mr. Henry said the boat stopped in 1920. I was under the impression that it was 22 when the last steamboat stopped, but I could be wrong, of course. And from there, he went to the Mackenzie River. And he went with the Northern Transportation Company, and eventually the Hudson Bay bought them out.
Mm-hmm.
And he's with the Hudson Bay as shipyard superintendent
Mm-hmm.
till 3 years ago when he died from a stroke.
I see. So your family's had quite a part in the history of the Caribou.
Yes, they're originally from the Caribou. But my recollection of the early days in South Fort George, of course, I was young and too young to pay much heed to things that were happening. I rode up and down on the boats, which Mr. Henry knows. And
I suppose Mr. Henry would be working on the boats.
yes, Mr. Henry was there. And my biggest attraction was that was the chief engineer, whose name was Mr. Mavis, Frank Mavis, who was tattooed all over his chest and down his back. And he would take his shirt off, and he could move and flex his muscles to move the snake or these different things he had. And we would spend the time in the engine room watching Mr. Mavis flex his muscles and work the snakes and tattoos he had, and blueberry pies from the cook. And I believe the Chinese cook was there, is still in Prince George. In fact, I'm sure he is. And we rode up and down. And
This would
Mr.
be a
Henry's
great
job, of
adventure
course,
to
was-
you, I suppose.
well, it was, yes.
Yes.
And of course, Mr. Henry and my father and the rest of us, their job was to keep us away from the edge of the boat and keep us in where we belonged. But I used to be content to sit in the engine room and watch the connecting rods go in and out and concentrate in pie. But my brother next to me, who was 3 years younger than I, was inclined to travel. And at one time, as we come up the river, he was sitting on the cover over the paddle wheel in the back, which caused a bit of a ruckus, I remember. But as to the South Fort George, I started school, of course, in South Fort George and finished here. But when I come,
That was in what year, Mr. Davis?
it'd be 17.
1917.
And as I recollect, the Northern Hotel wasn't operating, although Mr. and Mrs. Al Johnson and the boys lived there, and they may have had rooms at that time, but I don't think the hotel was running. And the theater that Mr. Henry speaks of was across the street. And I couldn't say that it was operating.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. But in fact, I don't think it was. But the school was there when I come. It's the present school. It's still there. And the sawmill at Somerton's was not operating. It had closed up. And I would say the population when we come would possibly be 300 people, more
I
or
see.
less.
The boom was over.
It was
for
over, and they were
Southport.
moving to
Mhm.
Prince George.
What was your impression of Prince George as you
Well,
look back, Mr. Davis?
It appears to me that there were possibly 4 buildings on 3rd Avenue, about that many, and on George Street, where Bryan Motors are now, was the Dreamland Theater, and across the street was the Rex Theater at Mackenzie White's, and the Prince George Hotel was there, the George Street Pool Room, and C.C. Reed's grocery store, or the McKay Brothers grocery store was at the where the old unemployment insurance office was, and the building where Wood's drugstores was there, and Baird's was then P. Burns Butcher Shop, and a man by the name of Peters was the manager. George Peters was the manager of the butcher shop, and Roy White, who's presently in the city, was a butcher in there at that
Oh,
time.
I see.
And the farther down the street was the Astoria, which is the present Astoria, was the Royal Hotel then, the McDonald Hotel. I'm not too sure if it was there, but the Canada Hotel was there, and the Connaught Hotel. And there was nothing from there to the railroad then.
I guess the railroad was an accepted fact.
It wasn't
By the
accepted
time
back
you were
then.
here.
Yes, it was.
I think you mentioned to me the fact that there were some Yukoners living in Prince George.
Oh, yes, there were quite a number of Yukoners up till the late 20s were here. In fact, there's T.M. Watson, who's now in Vancouver, was a Yukoner, and there was quite a number of Yukoners. And I don't know how authentic this story is, but there was an old chap that lived below Connaught Hill whose name was Christopherson, and he had a long beard, and he was the chap that you may have read or heard tales of that sort of thing, but he fell in love with a dance hall girl in the Yukon during the gold rush days, and he told her if she would marry him that he would give her weight in gold, and she weighed 106 pounds or 10 pounds, and he did give her weight in gold, and she lived with him for approximately a year. Now, this old gent used to tell us these stories, and I have heard that I questioned Tom Griffith, who is a former businessman here and who was a Yukoner, and he said he had heard of it. He had heard of it, and several of the old-timers had heard of it, but and just how authentic it is, I don't know, of course.
Maybe we could go back to the boats, Mr. Davis. Can you recollect what crew was on with your father on the
Yes,
boats?
on the BX, there was Captain Brown, was the captain, and
I believe his wife is still in
she is still,
Southport.
yes, she's the daughter of Margaret Seymour.
Yes.
And the mate was Collins, a man, Jake Collins, George Henry. Frank Mavis was the engineer. I didn't know the second, of course. And W.R. Matheson. I don't recollect him as being a purser, although he was, but he was agent, I think, at the warehouse in Southport, George, when we come. And Willis James West was the manager of the company, and he was later manager of the B.C. canneries, I believe, at New Westminster. I understand he's still alive. I'm not too sure. But as I say, I rode the boats a good deal for the 3 or 4 years that they run, but I don't recollect too much of them.
I think you told me that one of your Saturday amusements was catching a ride on the boat.
Yes, whenever the boat would pull in, they used to go up to the Foley, Welch and Stewart cache, and underneath the bridge, and the lifters would go up, of course, the section of the bridge, and we used to ride up there and back down to their place at Southport, George. And then my father would haul them out in the fall, and we would be down on the riverbank when this was going on.
Did Mr. Davis stir up any more memories for you, Mr. Henry?
Well, he did, a few. He was very young when he was on the boats. In fact, I had to watch him a couple of times there. He was always on my road. And he said we went to the cache. Well, I'll correct him on that, and I think he'll side in with me. We went as far as Central. And then one year, the railroad wasn't into Vanderhoof, and we made a trip to Vanderhoof.
Up in Echaco.
Up in Echaco, right to Vanderhoof. And the BX didn't go there very much. Well, I think, if I, speaking right, I think it made one trip. But the Chillicoot made several trips to Vanderhoof.
I see.
And I also made quite a few trips myself with a small boat to Vanderhoof. With, it wasn't mail, it was just passengers would get up there and they wanted to come down, and they'd charter the boat, and up we'd go and get them and bring them down, and that was it. So whenever there was money, we'd go and get it.
I see. Well, I think perhaps I'd better thank you both for giving us the benefit of your memories tonight. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Mrs. Moran.
Information, please, is a presentation of the Sportsman Shop in Prince George. And first off, here is Len Fraser with a roundup of entertainment information.
Thanks very much, Mike Thornthwaite. First off, we'll take a look at the club functions.